On Friday morning, I was neck-deep in work. My project deadline loomed over me, and I was already mentally preparing to spend the weekend glued to my laptop, fine-tuning final edits. The office was buzzing with the usual chaos, calls ringing, keyboards clicking, and the faint hum of conversations in the background. Somewhere in the middle of my third cup of coffee and a spreadsheet that refused to balance, I remembered that Sarah, my wife, had mentioned her upcoming team-building retreat. It wasn't the first time her company had organized such an event, and usually, they were mundane affairs, a mix of forced smiles, motivational speeches, and awkward team exercises. But Sarah was diligent about work commitments, and she had shown me the official invitation earlier that week, a formal letter on company stationery, complete with logos, schedules, and a crisp signature from her boss. On Wednesday night, over dinner, Sarah had expressed mild reluctance about the trip. "Honestly, I'd rather stay home," she had said, her fork idly pushing around pieces of salad. "But it's mandatory, and skipping it isn't really an option." I had nodded in understanding, barely looking up from my plate. Work obligations were work obligations, and Sarah had always been someone who took her responsibilities seriously. Thursday evening, she had spent some time texting in her work group chat. I was half listening while going through my emails. From what I could hear, the conversation was all logistics: who was driving, what time they were leaving, and what to pack. Nobody mentioned names specifically, just vague references to the team or everyone else. At the time, it didn't strike me as odd. On Friday evening, Sarah began packing. I was in the living room, half watching a documentary while reviewing some notes for my project. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed her suitcase wasn't particularly full. 2 sets of clothes, her makeup bag, and a few miscellaneous items were all she had laid out. "Is that all you're taking?" I asked, glancing over the rim of my glasses. "Yeah," she said without looking up. "We'll be in a hotel, and most of the stuff will be provided. No need to overpack." Her tone was casual, and she seemed unbothered, so I dropped the subject. She mentioned she'd be traveling with a colleague named James, who would pick her up in the morning. "He's always on time," she said lightly. No unnecessary chit-chat. I didn't ask further. James was just another name in her professional circle, not someone I felt the need to think about. Saturday morning came, and Sarah left on schedule. James, whoever he was, didn't come to the door or even text to say he had arrived. Sarah simply walked out with her suitcase, gave me a quick kiss on the cheek, and was gone. I went back to my desk and buried myself in work. The hours melted into each other as I stared at spreadsheets, graphs, and endless lines of data. Around midday, Sarah sent me a few photos, a conference room with neatly arranged water bottles and company-branded folders, a close-up of her dinner plate featuring a steak and a glass of red wine, and a selfie in front of a mirror. She looked happy enough, though the background was nondescript, just a generic hotel hallway. Later in the evening, I took a break and sent her a voice message asking how everything was going. She replied an hour later with a quick call. Her voice was steady, but she sounded tired. "It's been non-stop lectures and team exercises all day," she said. "Everyone's acting like we're on some kind of school field trip." I laughed softly and asked if she was sharing a room with anyone. "Yeah, with Meg from accounting," she said casually. "She's nice enough, but I think she's hanging out with the others right now." Her words were straightforward, but something about the silence in the background caught my attention. No faint chatter, no music, not even the hum of activity from a hallway. But I brushed it off. Maybe she had stepped outside or found a quiet corner to talk. Sunday morning arrived, and Sarah sent another round of photos. A landscape shot from her hotel window, lush greenery and well-manicured lawns, and a whiteboard covered in scribbled diagrams from what seemed to be a presentation. The day passed slowly for me. I wrapped up my project in the early afternoon and decided to clean up the kitchen, organize the living room, and basically keep myself occupied until she returned. By evening, Sarah walked through the front door with a small paper bag in her hand. Inside was a souvenir magnet, the kind you'd find at any gas station gift shop. It had the city's name plastered across a cheesy landscape illustration. She looked tired but content, like someone who had endured a long but productive weekend. I asked her how the trip went, and she gave me a brief rundown: lectures, coffee breaks, and a few forgettable moments involving over-enthusiastic colleagues who couldn't handle their drinks. Nothing special, she concluded with a shrug. But Meg was a great roommate. Didn't snore or keep me awake. I chuckled and nodded. As we settled on the couch later that night, a random thought crossed my mind. "Hey," I said, "didn't they give you badges or ribbons or something? Usually, these events have name tags." Sarah barely glanced up from her phone. "Oh, I must have lost it," she said nonchalantly. "They weren't strict about wearing them anyway. Just on the first day, really." Her explanation was smooth, her expression unbothered. I didn't press the issue. We turned our attention back to the show playing on the screen. Sarah rested her head lightly against my shoulder, and for a few moments, the nagging thoughts in my head quieted down. But still, something lingered, a fleeting sense that there had been too many vague details, too many generic answers. I tried to pinpoint exactly what was bothering me, but couldn't. Maybe it was just the fatigue from my own work-heavy weekend clouding my mind. I told myself it was nothing. Sarah was here, back home, tired but safe. I shifted slightly and wrapped my arm around her shoulders. The TV flickered in front of us, casting soft shadows across the room. Maybe I had just been overthinking things. Maybe I'd spent too much time staring at screens and analyzing data, and now my brain was looking for patterns where there were none. It had been about a week since Sarah returned from her team-building trip, and everything seemed to settle back into its usual rhythm. Work kept me busy, and our daily routines fell back into place. But then, one evening, Sarah came home visibly shaken. Her face was pale, her movements jittery, and her voice carried an edge of urgency as she spoke. "My friend is going through a terrible divorce," she said, dropping her bag on the kitchen counter. "She's an emotional wreck, crying all the time. I can't leave her alone like this." I listened carefully as Sarah laid out the situation. Her friend, someone I had met a few times before, was allegedly in a deep depression. Sarah explained that her friend had been struggling to cope with the overwhelming emotions, that she couldn't eat or sleep properly, and that she had no one else she could rely on. Sarah said she might need to stay over at her friend's place occasionally, just to make sure she didn't do anything reckless. I nodded, trusting Sarah completely. She had always been the caring type, someone who would drop everything to help a friend in need. Over the next few days, Sarah began spending nights away from home. She would leave with a small overnight bag and promise to keep me updated. Occasionally, she would send me photos, a steaming mug of tea on a wooden table, a dimly lit window looking out at a city street, or a stack of tissues next to a half-empty water bottle. They were ordinary photos, but they carried a certain melancholy that matched the story she was telling. Sometimes, Sarah would call me late at night, her voice soft and tired. She'd tell me about her friends' breakdowns, about how they sat on the couch talking for hours, or about how they went for long walks just to clear their heads. I could hear the exhaustion in her tone, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. I admired her willingness to be there for her friend, even at the cost of her own rest. A few times, Sarah's friend even called me directly. Her voice was shaky but sincere as she thanked me for understanding, and for allowing Sarah to spend so much time with her. "I don't know what I'd do without her," she said once, and I could hear genuine gratitude in her voice. These calls reassured me. They made everything seem more real, more believable. Sarah was meticulous about her explanations. She would tell me how her friend was still receiving angry messages from her ex-husband, or how she couldn't decide whether to sell her apartment and start fresh somewhere else. The details added weight to her story. They painted a picture of a woman who was truly in distress, and of my wife, the loyal friend, doing everything she could to help. But even with all these details, there were little gaps that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Sarah would sometimes mention that they had gone for a walk in a park, but when I asked which park, she would pause for just a fraction of a second before giving a vague answer. Or she would say they had talked late into the night but couldn't quite remember what time they went to bed. It was never anything glaring, just small inconsistencies that felt a little off. One evening, Sarah came home late. Her eyes were red, her face tired. She dropped onto the couch with a heavy sigh, and I didn't press her with questions. I could tell she had been crying, or at least it looked that way. Her makeup was slightly smudged, and her voice had that faint rasp people get after long conversations through tears. "She's just so lost," Sarah said softly, her head resting against the back of the couch. Another night, she told me she had been out getting medication for her friend. Apparently, her friend had a panic attack, and Sarah had to rush to a pharmacy late at night. She arrived home well past midnight, her phone battery nearly dead, and her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. "She's better now," Sarah said, sipping tea in the dim light of our kitchen. "At least for tonight." Despite the gaps and occasional odd details, Sarah was a master at redirecting attention. She'd ask about my work, about my deadlines, about whether I was taking care of myself. She'd listen attentively, nodding and making thoughtful comments as I talked about spreadsheets, stubborn clients, or upcoming meetings. It was hard to hold on to any lingering doubts when she was so genuinely engaged in our conversations. Eventually, Sarah suggested that her friend come over for tea. "She feels terrible for taking up so much of my time," Sarah explained. "I think it might make her feel better to thank you in person." The day her friend visited, she arrived with a slightly awkward smile and a small box of cookies as a thank you gift. She sat stiffly on our couch, clutching her mug of tea with both hands. She thanked me multiple times for being so understanding, for letting Sarah spend so much time with her. She seemed fragile, almost breakable, but also uncomfortable, as if she didn't quite know how to act in our home. After she left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything specific. Just a lingering unease. But Sarah was quick to distract me again, pulling me into conversation about my upcoming presentation at work and asking about the progress of my project. One evening, as Sarah sent me another photo from her friend's place, a steaming cup of tea next to a window, I found myself asking aloud, "Why are all your photos so neutral? Why don't you ever send me a picture with her in it?" Sarah turned to me with an expression of mild disbelief, her brow furrowing. "Are you serious?" she asked. "Do you really think I'm going to take pictures of my friend crying her eyes out? That's a terrible idea. Honestly." Her response was sharp, but it made sense. I felt a little embarrassed for even asking. "Okay," I said with a small nod. "Forget it." And just like that, the doubt slipped away, replaced by the hum of the television and the steady rhythm of our lives continuing as usual. A couple of weeks had passed since Sarah's late-night visits to her friend had become less frequent. Things at home felt calmer, and our routines began to settle back into a predictable rhythm again. I was spending most of my free time working on the garage with a few close friends. It was a project we'd been putting off for months, and now we were finally making progress, repainting the walls, installing sturdy new shelves, and fixing some persistent wiring issues. I was fully absorbed in the work, hands covered in paint, head filled with measurements and hardware store shopping lists. One evening, Sarah came home with a bright expression on her face. She announced that her friend had recently received a promotion at work after completing some professional training courses. Inspired by her friend's success, Sarah had signed up for similar courses herself. "It's a big opportunity for my career," she said with confidence. She explained that the courses were held in the evenings and occasionally included off-site practical sessions. The schedule, she added, was inconsistent. Some classes ran late, while others required additional consultations with instructors. Sarah was meticulous in her preparation. She printed out a detailed course schedule and showed it to me. The sheet had dates and times neatly arranged in columns, but I noticed there were no specific addresses or names of instructors listed. At the time, it didn't seem unusual. Not every training program shares those kinds of details up front. She even asked for my opinion while picking out professional-looking outfits for her classes, blazers, blouses, and tailored skirts. I didn't think twice about it. Sarah had always taken her work seriously, and I was proud to see her investing in her professional growth. In the evenings, Sarah would leave the house with her laptop and a small stack of notebooks tucked under her arm. She looked every bit the diligent professional heading off to improve her skills. Sometimes, she'd return home with a few sheets of handwritten notes, casually flipping through them as if reviewing key concepts from her class. At a glance, the note seemed legitimate: paragraphs of text, scattered bullet points, and a few underlined phrases. But if I had taken a closer look, I might have noticed that most of the content was disjointed, almost like excerpts copied randomly from textbooks. While Sarah was at her courses, I was usually deep in the garage project with my friends. We worked long hours, fueled by takeout food and shared jokes. The smell of paint, the hum of power tools, and the satisfaction of completing small milestones kept me focused. My mind rarely drifted to Sarah's schedule. When I did think of her, it was usually in passing, wondering how her class was going or if she was managing to keep up with the material. Sarah would occasionally send me photos during her classes. They followed a familiar pattern: a steaming cup of coffee next to her laptop, an open notebook filled with scribbles, or a vague city view from what looked like an office building window. The photos were convincing enough, though they lacked people or any identifiable landmarks. Once, I asked her why there were never any classmates or instructors in her photos. She gave me a simple explanation: it feels awkward to snap pictures during serious lectures. It made sense at the time, so I let it go. One week, Sarah mentioned that her group would be taking a practical workshop in a neighboring city. She told me that they might have to stay overnight in a hotel because the sessions would run late into the evening. I nodded along, already mentally preparing to spend another night knee-deep in paint cans and tangled wires. That night, Sarah sent me a photo supposedly from her hotel room, her laptop perched on a bed, a notebook lying open next to it, and a glass of wine on the nightstand. She called me briefly, her voice carrying that familiar tired edge. "It's been such a long day," she said over the phone. "I'm exhausted. I can't wait to come home tomorrow." Her voice sounded sincere, and the exhaustion felt real. I told her to get some rest, and we said goodnight. When Sarah returned the next day, she looked genuinely tired but oddly content. She flopped onto the couch and let out a long sigh before giving me a brief summary of the workshop. She mentioned abstract themes they had covered, like leadership strategies and performance metrics, but avoided specifics. She didn't mention any instructor names or share any stories about her classmates. At one point, I noticed a crumpled receipt poking out of her purse. I caught a glimpse of the text, something about a restaurant bill, a date, and a time. I didn't bring it up. Sarah had a ready explanation for anything. If she noticed me glancing at the receipt, she didn't let it show. "We grabbed dinner after the workshop," she said casually a day later. "It's hard to focus on an empty stomach." Her explanation was smooth and unbothered, and I didn't push further. Over the following weeks, Sarah's schedule continued in the same inconsistent rhythm. Some nights she'd come home late, her face pale from what looked like exhaustion. Other times, she'd arrive with a smile and a light-hearted remark about how draining the courses had been. Occasionally, she'd bring home small treats, a pastry wrapped in a paper bag or a fancy coffee cup with a cardboard sleeve. "For you," she'd say with a smile, placing the treat on the kitchen counter. Every now and then, inconsistencies would catch my attention. A comment that didn't align with something she'd said before, a vague answer to a specific question, or the occasional slip in detail about her supposed coursework. But whenever I brought it up, Sarah had an answer ready. "Honestly," she said one evening with a weary laugh, "I can barely keep track of it myself. First, the team-building trip, then my friend's breakdown, and now these courses. My head's spinning." She looked at me with tired eyes, and any lingering suspicion I might have had melted away. Sarah was home, she was tired, and she was doing her best to balance everything. I nodded and let the matter drop. Later that evening, she placed a warm croissant on my desk while I was reviewing some emails. "Brought this for you from class," she said with a soft smile before disappearing into the bedroom. I picked up the pastry and took a bite. It was still slightly warm, buttery, and flaky. Whatever doubts I might have had earlier dissolved in that moment. Sarah was here, and life carried on. It all started when Sarah came home one evening and announced with visible excitement that she had been asked to help organize a major art exhibition. Her eyes lit up as she explained the details, coordinating logistics, managing exhibit layouts, overseeing deliveries, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. It sounded like an enormous responsibility, and she spoke with a sense of purpose and enthusiasm that was hard not to admire. I nodded along, impressed by her dedication. It seemed like a noble task, something significant that she could truly take pride in. At the time, I was deeply engrossed in a major project at work. Deadlines were looming, and I often found myself staying late at the office, shuffling between meetings and trying to resolve persistent roadblocks. Our schedules naturally fell out of sync. Sarah would leave for her exhibition duties in the late afternoon or early evening, and I would come home well past dark, exhausted and distracted by my own set of challenges. Sarah prepared meticulously for her new role. She showed me brochures for the exhibition, complete with elegant fonts, artistic images, and a glossy finish. She had a laminated pass with her name and the event's official logo, clipped neatly to a lanyard. One evening, she spread out a stack of papers on the dining table, floor plans of the exhibition halls, lists of tasks, and scribbled notes in the margins. It looked complex and important, and I felt proud seeing her so deeply invested in something that seemed to matter so much. She mentioned early on that the building hosting the exhibition was an old structure with thick stone walls, which interfered with mobile reception. Calls might drop, texts might not go through, and sometimes she might not be able to respond until much later. It seemed plausible enough. I'd been in older buildings where my phone turned into little more than a pocket-sized brick. Sarah was also clear about the building's strict security protocols. After a certain hour, no one who wasn't directly involved in the event was allowed entry. Even if I wanted to drop by and surprise her, I wouldn't be able to get past the security guards. Again, it made sense in the context of an event with valuable artworks on display. She began sending me photos from the exhibition space. Vast, empty halls with half-constructed booths, decorative elements leaning against walls, stacks of unopened boxes waiting to be unpacked. There was an authenticity to the images that made it easy to believe her narrative. Occasionally, she would send short voice messages. In the background, there was always a faint echo, the sound of distant chatter, and what seemed like faint metallic clinks and thuds, the ambient noise of a large, hollow space where work was underway. Sarah spoke often about her team. She described them as hardworking and focused, but never mentioned anyone by name. They were always just the guys or the team. When she described their tasks, it was always in broad strokes: we moved the sculptures today, or we finalized the lighting layout. Her descriptions lacked detail, but at the time, I didn't notice. One evening, Sarah came home visibly exhausted. She dropped her bag on the floor and fell into a chair with a heavy sigh. She explained that she'd been tasked with overseeing the transportation of a particularly valuable exhibit, a rare sculpture that required careful handling and coordination. According to her, the process was fraught with tension. At one point, someone nearly dropped the piece while unloading it from a truck. She recounted the scene in vivid detail, the sharp intake of breath from everyone in the room, the collective sigh of relief when the sculpture was finally secured. Her face looked genuinely strained as she spoke, and I had no reason to doubt her. Sometimes, Sarah would ask me for small favors related to the exhibition. She'd hand me a stack of papers to print or ask me to cut pieces of paper into precise shapes for booth labels. Once, she had me drop off a box at an address across town. These little tasks made me feel involved, like I was contributing in some small way to her project. It felt real because I was actively participating, even if only on the periphery. There was one night when Sarah said she wouldn't be coming home at all. Apparently, a glitch in the security system had forced her and a couple of other organizers to stay overnight with the guards. She described how they had gathered in a small corner of the exhibition hall, drinking lukewarm coffee and chatting quietly while waiting for the issue to be resolved. Her voice carried a mix of weariness and amusement when she told me about it, and again, it all sounded entirely plausible. But then, little things began to gnaw at the edges of my mind. Her voice messages, while consistent, were always incredibly short. They never felt spontaneous or rushed, just carefully measured and almost rehearsed. The background noise, too, started to sound repetitive. The same faint echo, the same distant metallic clangs, the same muffled voices. One night, while listening to a recording she had sent, I realized that it sounded almost identical to one she had sent a week before. I brought it up casually one evening. "Why do your voice messages always sound the same?" "The background noise, I mean." Sarah was quick to respond. She set down the cup of tea she was holding and looked me straight in the eye. "What kind of noise do you expect?" she said with a faint laugh. "It's an exhibition space, not a circus. We work in teams, the tasks are repetitive, and honestly, it's the same sounds day in and day out." She said it so matter-of-factly that I felt almost embarrassed for bringing it up. She wasn't wrong, repetitive tasks often create repetitive noise. I let the thought go, brushed it aside like dust on a shelf. It started with an official email. Sarah showed me the message from her boss one evening after dinner. The email outlined a sudden but crucial business trip to another city for negotiations with key clients. Everything looked formal and professional: her name, the company letterhead, the dates, and even the location of her stay at a reputable hotel. She forwarded me her flight confirmation as well, complete with booking details. There was no reason to doubt its authenticity. Sarah prepared for the trip calmly. She packed a small suitcase, emphasizing that this was a strictly professional visit. "No need for extra clothes," she said as she folded a few blouses into her bag. Her demeanor was steady, her voice confident. Before leaving, she reassured me that she'd call every evening and send photos to keep me updated. I trusted her completely. After all, everything she had shown me seemed legitimate. The day of her departure arrived, and Sarah left early in the morning. I helped her load her suitcase into the taxi, kissed her goodbye, and watched as the car disappeared down the street. With my own workload piling up, I barely had time to dwell on her absence. Work had been relentless lately, and even when I wasn't in the office, my mind was tangled in spreadsheets and client emails. That evening, Sarah sent me her first photo from the hotel room. The image showed a neatly made bed with crisp white sheets, her laptop open on the desk, and a faint cityscape visible through the window. "Just finished a long day of meetings," her message read. "It was exhausting, but I think we made progress." Her voice during our brief phone call later that night sounded tired but genuine. She spoke about demanding clients, long presentations, and tricky negotiations. I listened, offered a few words of encouragement, and we said our good nights. The second day followed a similar pattern. Sarah sent me another series of photos: a disposable coffee cup with a sleeve bearing a local cafe's logo, a shot of a brightly lit corridor with anonymous office furniture, and a blurry image of what looked like a conference room. Her messages painted a picture of a long, tiring day filled with back-to-back meetings. "The clients are tough, but I'm holding my ground," one text said. That night, Sarah mentioned in passing that her colleagues had invited her out to dinner. "Just something casual," she said. "We need to decompress after such a hectic day." I didn't question it. I was also buried under my own workload, juggling tasks and trying to meet deadlines. When Sarah's messages slowed down later that night, I assumed she was simply busy, or perhaps the Wi-Fi in the hotel was acting up. The next morning, she sent me a brief apology: "Sorry about last night. Wi-Fi was terrible, and I was dead tired. Today's another packed schedule." But then came the third day. It was quiet. Too quiet. Sarah didn't send any messages all day. The occasional text I sent went unanswered. I reassured myself that she was probably stuck in meetings or dealing with a difficult client. By mid-afternoon, doubt started to creep in. My phone stayed silent, and each passing hour felt heavier than the last. Finally, in the evening, Sarah sent a single text: "I'm sorry. It's been a crazy day. No energy left. Tomorrow I'll be home." The message felt off. Too brief, too mechanical. But I brushed the thought aside. I was exhausted myself, and I convinced myself that I was just overthinking. That night, my boss called me unexpectedly and asked if I could cover an additional shift the next day. Without hesitation, I agreed. The distraction would keep my mind occupied, and I could finish up some overdue tasks. The hours passed in a blur of emails, meetings, and phone calls. I didn't notice how late it had gotten until the office emptied out and I was one of the last people there. I returned home that evening expecting Sarah to already be back. But the house was quiet, dark, and empty. I checked my phone, no messages, no missed calls. I sat down on the couch and stared at the screen, waiting for the familiar chime of a notification. Then my phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. I hesitated for a moment before answering. The voice on the other end was male, calm but firm. "Are you the husband of Sarah?" I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "Yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, your wife has been admitted to the hospital. She lost consciousness. We need a family member here to confirm her identity and make decisions regarding her care." I froze. The words echoed in my ears, but my brain refused to process them. Hospital? Unconscious? How? Where? Wait, I managed to croak out. What happened? Where did you find her? The man on the line hesitated briefly before answering. She was found unconscious in an apartment. The resident called emergency services. "We need you to come immediately." An apartment. Not a hotel. Not a conference center. An apartment. My mind began to race. Questions hit me like a tidal wave, each one sharper and heavier than the last. Why was she in an apartment? Who did it belong to? Why wasn't she in her hotel room? Why wasn't I hearing this from her directly? My hands were trembling as I ended the call and grabbed my keys. My chest felt tight, and my vision blurred slightly as I moved mechanically, wallet, phone, jacket. I didn't even remember locking the door behind me as I rushed to my car. The drive felt endless. My mind was a storm of fragmented thoughts and disjointed images. Sarah unconscious on a cold floor. Strangers standing over her. An apartment I couldn't picture. Everything up until now, the emails, the photos, the carefully crafted updates, flooded back into my mind, each detail now sharp and suspicious. Had I missed something obvious? Had I ignored the signs? I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white against the leather. My chest ached with a pressure I couldn't release. What was she doing there? Why wasn't she in her hotel? Why was I hearing this from a stranger and not from her? With every passing second, the weight of those questions grew heavier, suffocating me. But there were no answers, only the empty road ahead and the cold, unfamiliar voice on the other end of that phone call. I drove faster, desperate to reach the hospital, desperate for clarity, desperate for something, anything, that made sense. The hospital was cold and sterile, filled with the scent of disinfectant and faint echoes of hurried footsteps. I walked through the corridors, clutching my jacket in one hand and Sarah's purse in the other. My mind was a chaotic mess of fragmented thoughts and unanswered questions. When I reached the reception, a nurse directed me to the doctor overseeing Sarah's care. His face was calm but carried the weight of difficult news. "Your wife was found unconscious in an apartment," the doctor began, choosing his words carefully. "It appears there was an incident during intimate activity. The circumstances suggest that something went terribly wrong." I felt the blood drain from my face. Intimate activity. My wife. An apartment that wasn't her hotel room. The doctor went on, but I stopped hearing him after that. My mind latched onto those words and refused to let go. I barely registered the part where he mentioned an object, a baseball bat, being involved. I didn't want to know any more. My stomach twisted in a way I'd never felt before. "You should prepare yourself before you see her," the doctor said softly. When I stepped into Sarah's room, I froze. Machines beeped softly, tubes snaked around her body, and her face was pale against the sterile white pillow. For a moment, I couldn't move. This was my wife, the woman I'd shared years of my life with, now lying unconscious and vulnerable in a hospital bed. But the image of her in that apartment, the implications of what had happened, hung over me like a shadow. The nurse handed me a small plastic bag with Sarah's personal belongings, her phone, her wallet, and a few scattered items. I clutched it tightly as I turned and walked out of the hospital. The drive home was silent. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I couldn't process it. I couldn't make sense of any of it. When I got home, I dropped the bag on the kitchen table and stared at it for what felt like hours. Eventually, I grabbed Sarah's phone and turned it on. The screen lit up, and her familiar wallpaper appeared, a picture of us from a vacation long ago. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to keep going. What I found on that phone unraveled everything. There were messages, detailed plans, and carefully crafted lies. Sarah had been meticulous. Every absence, every excuse, every carefully timed message, it was all there. She had coordinated every outing, every alibi, every cover story with ruthless precision. Her friend in distress, her career courses, her exhibition project, all of it was a smokescreen. The messages between her and her lover were explicit, both in content and in the level of planning. They spoke about when and where to meet, how to avoid raising suspicion, and even how to handle me if I ever started asking too many questions. They joked about my obliviousness. They mocked my trust. Every photograph she had sent me over the past few months, the coffee cups, the hotel windows, the blurry office corridors, had been carefully staged. The attention to detail was almost impressive. But all I felt was rage. I spent hours combing through every message, every call log, every detail I could find. There was no denying it, no way to misinterpret what I was seeing. My wife, the woman I had trusted with every part of my life, had been living a double life right under my nose. At some point, the sun began to rise. I hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, hadn't even moved from my spot at the table. My decision was clear. Divorce was inevitable. There was no coming back from this. But I wasn't going to act recklessly. Sarah was still in a coma, and for now, time was on my side. I called a lawyer first thing in the morning. I explained the situation, forwarded him copies of the messages, the photos, everything I had found on her phone. He assured me that the evidence was damning and that the divorce proceedings would be straightforward. Over the next few days, I secured everything. Bank accounts, property deeds, savings, I locked it all down. I made sure Sarah would have no leverage, no claims, no power to contest anything once she woke up. Every legal document was signed, notarized, and filed. I moved forward with cold precision, fueled by a mix of anger, betrayal, and grim determination. I wasn't going to let her deceit cost me more than it already had. The divorce went through smoothly. Sarah's coma served as a valid reason to expedite the process. The evidence of her infidelity left no room for dispute. Legally, financially, emotionally, I had severed every tie. But closure didn't come. Not really. Even after the papers were signed, even after every asset was secured, there was a hollowness that nothing could fill. I kept replaying moments in my head, the photos she had sent, the stories she had told, the smile she had given me every time she walked out the door. It was all a lie. I thought that was the end of it. I thought I had reached the final chapter of this twisted saga. But I was wrong. Because just when I started to believe that the dust had settled, something else happened. Something I could never have anticipated. You might think this is the end of the story. But let me tell you, it's far from over. The most unexpected part was still ahead. 5 years had passed since everything fell apart. In that time, I had rebuilt my life from the ground up. I sold the old house, moved to a quieter neighborhood, and started over. It wasn't easy at first, but eventually, the pieces began to fall into place. I met someone new, Emily. She was kind, supportive, and brought a sense of calm into my life that I hadn't realized I was missing. We got married 2 years after meeting, and though I carried scars from my past, Emily's steady presence made healing feel possible. Our new home was modest but warm, with a backyard where we often spent summer evenings grilling or sitting by a small fire pit. Emily and I had developed a comfortable routine: weekend trips, quiet breakfasts, and simple moments of togetherness. The shadows of my past had faded, and I felt, for the first time in years, that I was living a life free of deception and chaos. It was a crisp autumn evening when it happened. Emily was preparing dinner in the kitchen, and I was in the living room, sorting through some old paperwork. The doorbell rang unexpectedly. We weren't expecting company, and at this hour, it was unusual for anyone to drop by unannounced. I opened the door and froze. Standing there, in the dim glow of the porch light, was Sarah. She looked different. Her face was pale and gaunt, her hair hung limp around her shoulders, and her eyes were wild and glassy. She was wearing a wrinkled coat, and her hands were trembling slightly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "Why did you leave me?" she said, her voice sharp and unsteady. "Why did you abandon me?" I could only stare at her, my mind racing to process the situation. This was surreal. 5 years had passed without a word from her, and now she was standing on my doorstep, hurling accusations at me. "You left me in that hospital," she continued, her voice rising. "You didn't even give me a chance to explain. You threw me away like garbage." Emily had come to the doorway now, her eyes wide with concern. I stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind me to prevent Sarah from seeing her. "You cheated on me, Sarah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You built a web of lies so elaborate that I can't even begin to list them. And then, because of your own recklessness, you ended up in a hospital bed. What exactly did you expect me to do? Pretend none of it happened?" Sarah's face twisted with anger and frustration. "I made mistakes, but you were supposed to be there for me. You were supposed to forgive me." The sheer audacity of her words left me speechless for a moment. Emily had stepped back inside, giving us space, but I could see her shadow behind the curtain. Sarah began pacing on the porch, her movements erratic and agitated. Her voice kept rising as she threw accusation after accusation my way. She was relentless, refusing to let me get a word in. At some point, Emily stepped outside again and firmly told Sarah to leave. That was when things escalated. Sarah turned her rage toward Emily, shouting incoherent accusations and blaming her for stealing me away. Emily, to her credit, stayed calm, but I could see the fear flickering in her eyes. I stepped between them, my voice firm as I told Sarah to leave our property immediately. But Sarah didn't leave. Instead, she stormed off the porch, walked to the side of the house, and picked up a decorative stone from our garden. In one swift motion, she hurled it at the front window. The glass shattered with a loud crash. Emily screamed, and I rushed toward Sarah, grabbing her wrist to stop her from picking up another object. But she broke free and moved toward my car, raising her fists and slamming them against the windshield. The sound of her hands hitting the glass echoed through the quiet street. I pulled my phone out and dialed the police with shaking hands. I gave them my address and explained the situation as calmly as I could. Sarah was still shouting, still flailing her arms, her words a jumble of anger and desperation. The flashing blue and red lights arrived faster than I expected. 2 officers approached cautiously, speaking softly as they tried to de-escalate the situation. Sarah collapsed onto the pavement, sobbing hysterically as they handcuffed her and gently guided her into the back of a squad car. The aftermath was quiet. Emily and I stood in the living room, surrounded by shards of glass and the cold night air seeping through the broken window. I could see the hurt in Emily's eyes, but she said nothing. She simply leaned into me and I wrapped my arms around her. The next few weeks were filled with legal proceedings and meetings with lawyers. Sarah's attorney argued that she had suffered a nervous breakdown, exacerbated by untreated trauma and stress. The court ruled in her favor, ordering mandatory psychological treatment and placing a restraining order against her. She was forbidden from approaching me or Emily ever again. The night of the confrontation stayed with me for a long time. I couldn't stop replaying her words, her face, the shattered glass. But slowly, life began to return to normal. Emily and I replaced the window, repainted the porch, and did our best to move on. Sarah, from what little I heard, had been making progress in therapy. She was reportedly starting over somewhere else, trying to rebuild a life from the wreckage of her choices. As for me, I finally let go of the last remnants of that chapter. Emily and I moved forward, stronger than before. The shadow of Sarah's betrayal no longer loomed over us. From that point on, everything truly felt settled. Sarah had her chance to start over, and I had mine. And this time, I was determined to make it count. From then on, everything was finally peaceful. Sarah began her new life, and I lived happily with my wife, Emily.